If you've been studying Chinese for months, maybe even a year, and you still freeze when you try to speak Chinese, I promise it's not your fault. It's the method. Most beginner to intermediate Chinese learners aren't actually bad at Chinese. A lot of them are very talented and motivated people, but sometimes they're just practicing the wrong things, myself included. It's about how effectively your brain can retrieve patterns and use them on demand. But most study methods to learn languages often don't train that, especially when you're learning a language in a school. So today I'm going to break down the main mistakes that Chinese learners often make when they're trying to improve their speaking skills and how you can address these issues to make sure that you're actually improving your Chinese speaking abilities. I previously made a video on how you can improve your Chinese speaking as a beginner, and this is kind of just a more in-depth run through of the mistakes that you should watch out for. So if you haven't watched the initial video, please feel free to check that out. But I promise if you fix these mistakes that I mentioned in this video, you will definitely see significant improvement in your Chinese speaking proficiency. The most common mistake I would say is memorizing individual words. I know I've touched on this before in previous videos, but it's just so common for beginner language learners to try to memorize individual words. For instance, you might memorize 开心工作时间. But when someone asks you something as simple as 你这周末做了什么, your brain freezes. Why? Speaking isn't about individual word retrieval. It's about recognizing and using patterns. When you speak, your brain doesn't retrieve one word at a time. It's more accustomed to pulling chunks that it's practiced before and implementing it into different situations. So instead of just memorizing 开心, you could instead try to remember the phrase我今天很开心，因为, and that's a very common sentence that you might be able to use in conversation or simply when you're trying to express yourself. Like, I'm very happy today because, right? And there's so many different things that you can add on afterwards, but by memorizing how you can actually phrase the idea of you're being very happy instead of just the word happy, then that will actually give you a lot more context into how you can use that word, then expand to different ideas. Or if something is making you particularly happy, you could just try to remember how to say 这件事情让我开心. This thing made me happy, right? And that is once again taking that one individual word happy and contextualizing it into a phrase that you might be able to recycle and reuse, that your brain will then create a spatial pattern so that next time you want to express something similar, that will just automatically be at the top of your head. You're training the structure in which you're expressing these certain ideas with the words that you know rather than individual vocab words. And that makes a key difference between studying Chinese and actually speaking it. Mistake 2 would be passive input only. While I really love watching C-dramas, and you guys know how I've advocated for it for improving your listening skills, if you're only watching dramas, listening to podcasts, you're not actually learning. You're not actually using the language that you're trying to learn. And so obviously input is very important, but it's not the only thing that you need to consider when trying to improve your Chinese speaking ability. And so listening passively, kind of helps you build that recognition for certain words, phrases, structures, but it's only if you actually speak and retrieve those words and information that you have buried in your brain that you'll actually start to see improvement in your speaking skills. Recognition means I know what that means when I hear it, but retrieval means that I can actually reproduce that instantly when I need to in conversation or in different contexts. So how can you address this mistake? Well, what I recommend is controlled repetition. And how you do this is after you read or hear a sentence, you need to first say it out loud, change one element, and repeat it several times. For instance, if you hear 我明天要早点起床, then you can modify it in different ways, such as 我今天要早点睡觉, 我下周要早点出门, 我明天不要太晚. You see how I use like the main key words and similar phrasing, but I kind of changed it up to put it into different contexts. That way I know 明天, 今天, 我. I'm then associating like 起床, but 睡觉. Those are basically like the replica of each other, but opposite. And so in that sense, I'm building my vocabulary and realizing in what context I need to use certain words rather than just listening and understanding the initial phrase, 我明天要早点起床. And in this way, your brain is going to be a lot more flexible. You're not just recognizing things, you're actually manipulating in a way to expand your vocabulary. One little thing that I want to add here is that a lot of beginners think that they're not studying enough, but most of the time, as I mentioned earlier in the video, it's really not about the quantity, but how you're actually training the skill that you're trying to perfect. You can study for 2 hours a day, but if none of that training involves actually retrieving the language from your brain and implementing it into different scenarios, then speaking will still feel exceedingly hard, because speaking isn't built by exposure. It's actually built through strain. And so what does that mean? Well, if your brain never feels like there's strain or stress put on it, as in you're not experiencing those moments where you're asking yourself,
Wait, how do I say that? How do I phrase this?
then that means that more likely than not, you're not actually learning and growing and stimulating the neurons in your brain to kind of activate and build that skill and proficiency. So while passive input may feel productive, you may feel like you're absorbing a lot of information and improving your Chinese abilities, you're not actually building up your ability to actively recall and retrieve the words that you're going to need in speaking context, so your Chinese speaking won't improve drastically. So now let's talk about one of these psychological factors that may be placing you in this comfort zone where you're only using passive input as opposed to active learning. The third mistake, and also a very common one, is waiting until you feel confident. If you wait till you feel ready to actually start speaking Chinese, then I hate to break it to you, but you most likely will never start speaking, because you're never going to necessarily feel ready and 100% confident. A lot of beginners might think, I'll start speaking when I know more words, but confidence doesn't come before speaking. You have to actually practice to slowly and progressively build up that confidence. The more you practice and the more you repeat certain phrases, the more confident you'll feel in being able to express yourself in different contexts with those words that you're slowly and progressively becoming more familiar with. In reality, fluency in a language isn't about being perfect, but it's about being able to speak with less hesitation than before as you use the language more often and in different contexts. In reality, you don't need long conversations. Small, minimal inputs progressively each day can make a very big difference in the long run. Every day, you can just describe what you're doing, state your opinions on certain things in brief, short sentences. And it doesn't even have to be a complete sentence. It can be a very short thought. For instance, 我现在在喝咖啡，我觉得这个有点贵，等一会儿我要去跑步。These are just kind of contexts that you might come across in your life, and they're going to train automatic retrieval for different phrases. In my next video, I'm going to explain how you can actually think in Chinese, which will eventually translate into you being able to speak in Chinese in a more effective and efficient manner. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, please consider subscribing. And so the key is not wanting to memorize individual words, recognizing patterns, and not being afraid to speak, even if you might not be perfect. Also, if you have any questions or ideas or suggestions on videos that you'd like me to make in the future, please do feel free to let me know down below in the comments, and I'll be sure to make them as soon as possible. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like, and I'll see you guys in the next one.